I have to do this kind of quickly because I want to leave a little time for questions, but I'm going to give you kind of the point of the talk in the beginning, and then we'll talk about how I got there. And so the point of the talk is that for me, as a games writer, over the last couple of years, I've come to the conclusion that like no matter how well one writes for games, there's still some problems. And so this is kind of about like my personal journey of learning that like I could be the best writer in the world and still make bad games, basically, which is something I had some practice doing. So so let's get started. So I started working in games around 2002. Like I said, I'm mostly a writer. These are some of the franchises I've written for. The most recent thing was this Blade Runner VR game, which was really kind of fun. It was a nice experience to kind of do something with VR. Now, in between all of these things, there's also a lot of things that like either didn't ship or that I'm still not allowed to talk about, or that aren't out yet, which is a big part of writing. This is a project I worked on in Ukraine for a year. The only thing I'm allowed to show you is this picture of a unicorn that, for some reason, was sent to Felicia Day. I'm not entirely sure why, but so it's because writers are relatively cheap. Sometimes the work that we do is the most disposable part of the projects, and so sometimes you'll be brought on at the very end of a game. And it's sort of like, can you just write it now? Like the game's done, can you write it? And sometimes you work from like the very beginning and then they change everything. Most people might think that what the scripts in games look like are kind of like the image on the left, like a very Hollywood sort of style screenplay. Really, most of what I do is spend my time, probably like a lot of the designers here, working with spreadsheets, which is always exciting. And with these spreadsheets, you have like maybe 100 gaps that you have to fill, right? Like, and it'll be a line for when somebody picks up a health pack, and then there'll be 50 of them. And it's like, or like reloading, there'll be 50 of them. And there really aren't 50 ways to say reloading, or I got a health pack. So I thought, so I was working on a game and kind of staring and probably drinking a little bit and staring at one of these big spreadsheets. And I had what I thought was a really good idea. This is my approximation of what I think code looks like. I just made this. This is not an actual coding language. I just made this up. But basically, I said, oh, okay, if your health is at different levels when you pick up the health pack, the character can say something different, right? So if you're like dead or almost dead and you get a health pack, you should be like, oh, wow, that was amazing. Like, yeah. But if you have like, if you're like 95% health and you pick up the same health pack, the character should probably acknowledge that like that's a little bit of a waste, or maybe he or she could have given it to one of the other characters, and the character's a little bit of a jerk. So, so I figured, I'm like, look at the logic on this. It's if, and then this other thing. This should be super easy. There's no engineering involved. So I go to one of the producers. Actually, I've done this a couple times. I go to a producer on the game I'm working on. I'm like, hey, can't we put in a little bit of context as to and then it'll be easier for me to write, because if I have context, then it's like I'm not kind of staring into this void, right? So of course that got killed like instantly. They were like, no, engineering resources are required. There's no way we're going to give engineering resources to the story of the game, right? I mean, why would you do that? So I had to kind of come up with my own system. And the problem is that I would be looking at these games and like it'd be shooting, and then there'd be some story, and then there'd be some shooting, and then there'd be some story. And every bit of story had to set up more shooting, which I don't know, as a writer is really hard. It's like, great, let's go shoot 40 people. Like, it's like every time you have to do that. And so I kind of realized that this is a pattern. And I think there's a reason why the market is maybe moving away. I think people get a little tired of this, because you can see through it, right? I mean, you're like, okay, we're going to go shoot more people. Like, great story. Which has a lot of people asking about, like, why there are even stories in some games at all. And when I'm thinking about it, like, this kind of thing, when I was a kid, this was a story game. I mean, and these games have more interactivity in them than most of the stories and most of the narrative games. Now, people like Mike were up here talking about, a narrative-based game earlier, but I mean, this is like more, the text parser is more interactive than a lot of the stuff we have right now. So I don't think that storytelling is going to go away, but I do think we're kind of at a point, or at least for me, at a point where we're going to have to kind of change the way that we tell stories, especially in interactive games, in order to kind of acknowledge the audience. The audience deserves to be acknowledged a little bit better. So I'm going to try to go to the next slide. Hang on. There we go. Ooh, look at that. So everybody starts every presentation on storytelling with the campfire, where like, cavemen would come around and they would talk. And it's sort of this metaphor for like why we tell stories and where storytelling started. And the thing is that everybody kind of doesn't acknowledge that like the campfire is interactive, right? I mean, in a campfire, I'll start telling a story about how I threw a rock at a giraffe, and then somebody else will go, no, that's not how it happened, and then I'll have to correct my story. And it's a little bit like stand-up comedy with a really bad audience where people are yelling back at you all the time. But I mean, so, and the other thing that's important about sort of like the storytelling, the campfire, societies that invented or recognized fiction evolved. So like Neanderthals didn't really have fiction, and they got kind of left behind. Homo sapiens, the species that we all are now trotting the globe, evolved storytelling. And so there's an important part of like the way that we organize as societies around fiction. So it's important to get this right as game creators and as just, as creative people. Right now we have a lot of different platforms, too many probably. And, we have a lot of but most of the stories that we are told are isolated to one of these platforms. And sorry that my font's a little different, I guess. And there's really not a lot of overlap in most of the stories that we tell. So if I watch a TV show, that doesn't necessarily, if I play a game, that doesn't change the story of a TV show with the same characters in it. If I play the Game of Thrones game, the Game of Thrones TV show is the same, right? But now we have these emerging technologies like augmented reality and virtual reality, and some of the cool things is what's going on in VR especially is it's about looking around a space, but it's also about that space being reactive to you. And if that space reacts to you in one form, you're going to want that form to influence the way that stories are told in other forms and other platforms. So we need to kind of start thinking about stories in a systemic way. Because right now we are like this cat trying to get into the screen, and we are, stymied by what's going on. Okay, hang on. Excellent. Okay, so the first thing we need is actually stories that are aware of the audience. Like, stories need to be able to listen to choices that you make, they need to be able to analyze the actions that you make, and they need to be kind of reward you as a viewer for participating, right? And that in and of itself is going to be, and some games do that, but in and of itself, this is, the kind of first step towards immersion, right? Now, immersion is something that has a really fuzzy definition. I mean, this kind of trippy stuff, this was immersive, taking chemicals and, making yourself feel poisoned. This was sort of immersion up until about 100 years ago. And then we got games, and so games were going to kill TV. They were going to be the kind of, the harbinger of this interactive future. But I mean, the problem with games is, some people, whoa, well, there we go. I don't know what that means, but they're not for everybody, right? But as storytellers, as people who like interactive storytelling, we need to kind of recognize that there's an audience that's outside of games to whom we also can start speaking. And the places where that audience is found today are things like text messaging. They're doing things like, they're just looking at web pages, they're looking at social media, and they like these things because the stories, react to them in ways that are real time. And, if you post something on Facebook or VKontakte or whatever, and your friends react to it, you text somebody, they react to it, and so you're having these kind of interactive conversations all the time, but you can't have them with fiction, right? And so the first thing we need to start thinking about is that people are constantly changing channels all the time, and so whatever tools that we need tools essentially that take a story on one channel and that will bring it across to on the other channel. So whether that's things like Netflix, internet-based TV, Hulu, or even text messaging, or even books or toys, like all of these platforms need to learn how to coordinate with each other. Hang on, there we go. And so what we'll get are, it doesn't like my GIFs, does it? Oh, well. All right, well, what we'll get is an intelligent connection between the story and the audience, and we'll kind of be able to ease the transition from moving from one channel to the other. That one works? Oh, I like this one. So if we're able to do that, if we're able to kind of create these sort of 360 environments, we, as our brains will start to relax the barriers between fiction and reality. And in the same way that we care about people who we only know from social media or something like that, we'll be able to form relationships with fictional characters because our minds are actually using the same processes to understand like our fictional lives and our actual lives. There we go. Okay. So I've been working with some friends on a company called Hexagram, and what we're trying to do is identify the pillars for this kind of emerging narrative forms. Hopefully these are going to awesome. Well, there we go. So the three pillars are exploration, character interaction, and agency. And then from those pillars, you get a bunch of different features that come up in a strange font, but that's all right. And each of these kind of fits. So exploration, there's things like location awareness and kind of nonlinear versus linear. The ability to personalize things like content or renders for each individual user. In terms of, so in the middle we have making the interfaces more accessible, having the characters react on an emotional level, and then the ability to kind of do what a lot of people are seeing in the kind of the chatbot world right now, which is natural language processing, being able to understand what's coming into the system. And then on the output side, you get rewards for the audience, you get narratives in which everybody's actually participating, and then you get delivery of context in a contextual, or delivery of content in a contextual manner. So what that breaks down to is an authoring process that looks something like this. You have your linear components of your story, you have your nonlinear components of the story. You have to think about where the story is going to live. You have to be able to access data, independent of every user in the world. You have to be able to access data that is dependent on a particular user, what they've done, what they've worked with in the past. And then you kind of put them all inside of a back-end system that includes the ability to talk, the ability to render to a game engine, and the ability to simulate aspects of whatever the world that you're playing is. And then that all comes in some way through a client. So this is a system that we're calling Saga. And getting back to the point of the talk, I mean, so this, what we're realizing in building this system is that the characters who, so this is, the guys in the guy in the Matrix on the left was the architect of the Matrix, and he was the one who realized that you have to give people choice in order for them to kind of be able to survive in the society of the Matrix. Robert Ford in Westworld has kind of a similar ethos where, when you go into his world, you're not defined by like a linear path. You actually have some sense of free will, right? And then Neo is the sort of the evocation of that free will, who came to kind of save the world. So as a writer, you need to start thinking like, even though these are characters from fiction, you need to kind of start thinking like they do, which is how are you going to build these systemic worlds that that allow people choice much broader than the choices that we're used to giving them in games. And and the nice thing about all of the work that people are doing on things like natural language processing is that they actually can process, or we now can actually process, a much broader range of spoken speech and kind of intent than we could in the past. So I mean, this for me, this is kind of where we're going. And so the system basically is combines like sort of the natural language components and things like that with a couple different, this is all not very interesting, a couple different ways to look at it. And we've identified kind of 8 features that hopefully will enable us to kind of build these systemic narratives. There's a rules engine, there's all the data on the objects and the characters in the world, there's the data for the user, there's kind of a system that handles all the linguistic stuff, there's an API that does API things and talks to clients, there's an analytics engine so you can actually see how the systems are performing, there's a simulation system, so actually each character in the world or the story can go out into sort of fictional places or real places or whatever they are, have experiences, and then come back and tell you about them. So you can literally ask a character in a game like, how was your day? And it will say, oh, I went to the park and there were 3 dogs, and they have variably interesting days. You need to be able to process some money, and then you need to have a place for all your content. So right now what we're actually doing is looking at taking these techniques and applying them to a physical place. And it looks like the first one's actually going to be kind of like a haunted house, which should be interesting because you'll have, I don't know if you've seen, there's a TV show called Black Mirror in which there's a character who gets an AR headset and goes into sort of a house that's very creepy looking, and it causes all these things to manifest around him. Sort of building something like that, probably not as cool as was on the show. But I mean, that's what we want to do. I mean, like, like a true immersive environment is sort of like if you take Westworld and like put it in a single building. And so we're trying to figure out a way to do something like that. Okay, good. All right. I'm sorry to go so fast. So if any of this is interesting or thoughtful for you guys, there's my email address. Feel free to drop me a line. I mean, and I think that there's kind of a really great future for this way of thinking. So if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear about them. Thanks.
Микрофон для вопросов.
Need a microphone for the questions. We also have gifts for the best questions, so don't be shy. Привет. Привет. Может, я заснул и что-то пропустил, но прошу прощения. Система, которую вы удивительно интересно выглядит, но есть ли какие-то практические применения?
Yeah, no, we've been actually building conversational chatbot characters with it.
Chatbot characters, but versus something available online already to to test it out.
No. So yeah, going back to the things you can't talk about. Yeah, we did a large year-long project for Disney based on all this stuff that I can't talk about. But there will be some things. There'll be some things early next year.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. Second question.
Yes.
Also, because this is mostly about interacting with fictional characters, if I understand correctly again.
Yeah.
Does your system involve expanding it into more systems for procedural narrative?
Yeah. So yes and no. I mean, so you still have to write. So the way to think about it, I'll go back a bit. The way to think about it is you have linear story and you have non-linear story, right? So what you're basically doing is moving through. There will be sections of the story that are mandatory, and there will be decisions that are mandatory. But then in between those sections, the characters have a much wider berth to go out and do procedural things, like I was saying, like go to the park. You can suggest places, so they can go to places in the real world. So we have one character who walks around New York, right? And so I can say, can you go to Central Park and look for dogs? And we'll go to Central Park. It will look at location-based images taken in the park recently of dogs, and then it will text me those dog pictures. So you know what I mean? So, or I can meet it later and say like, oh, hey, how was the park? And it'll go, oh, it was great. Here's some dog pictures that I found. Or it'll just talk about dogs. Like it'll ask me what my favorite kind of dog is. So, I mean, there's narrative to that, but it's not scripted. Like that same character might have a party the next day, and the party is a linearly scripted, like the character has to go to the party or the story won't continue. And at the party, the character will definitely meet Bob, right? Bob is going to be at the party. And then what I'll get is like, and it'll call me, it'll be like, oh my God, Bob's at this party, what should I do? And I'll be like, oh, you need to go talk to him. I mean, you did kill his sister. I mean, like, that's going to be a problem. And then she'll go, okay, thanks a lot. And then like go have that interaction and then come back and tell me what happened later.
Okay, understand. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for the lecture.
Sure.
I guess I want to ask you. You are talking mostly about AR and VR technologies, but what about the users who don't have that kind of technology but still want to enjoy such gameplay features?
Sure. I mean, I think AR and VR are sort of the tip of the spear for this kind of stuff. They are the places where you go and you get the highest level of fidelity because you can look around, you can talk, you can pick up things. But I mean, the nice thing, like, so the example I just described, or the first thing that we're doing, the thing will be out this year, is all through text messaging. So it's just pictures, audio, and text. So it's very accessible, right, for literally anybody.
So there's that, and I wanted to ask you about, well, there are all sorts of problems with MMORPGs currently. They don't have, well, most of them, like World of Warcraft, have repetitive gameplay, which is delivered via raids to provide endgame content when you reach the top level. But can we use this system with its plotting to provide an non-ending experience for the players in MMOs.
Kind of. I mean, so what we can do is build. So the way that the system works is every character in the world has what's called a role, and you can program the roles kind of like calendars. Like you can basically say, if it was the real world, you'd have a role for a businessman who'd wake up in the morning, go to work at the same place mostly every day, go have lunch, come back, do some more work, maybe go to dinner, and then go home, right? And then you could have another character whose role is like an artist, and the artist, I don't know, wakes up at noon and goes and has a coffee, and then goes to the studio and works way later, and then goes to the bar and stays out late, and then goes home. So you can take these kind of roles and give them to NPCs in an MMO, right? And so then they'll act a little bit like characters from like The Sims, right? They'll have their little simulated lives, and then they can connect with each other in a way that builds kind of like, like if there are two that have a conflict, and they bump into each other, then they will have that that'll happen whether you're watching or not, right? So you can use it to build kind of more procedural worlds, but it doesn't solve the content problems. What I'm trying to say, you still need to it'll make the world more interesting, but if you're level 80, you're level 80. If you run out of missions or quests or something like that, I think that those things actually need a designer. Like nobody's trying to replace designers. I think those things like activities and quests need to be curated by somebody who has, expertise in creating content. But I think, but you can make the world a little bit more lively.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is it subscription-based service? Do you want to make an offline version? And what about other languages?
Yeah, so right now...
what is the cost?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Right now what we're doing is using data, like actually users and data as the kind of metric for the costing. So it's kind of like using Amazon Cloud or web services or something. Like you pay for the number of people that are using it. You don't pay to write something for it. You just you can put up whatever you want. But right now we're just using it internally, kind of with partners, and we're kind of within hopefully, I don't know, a couple months, transition to being able to offer the service as a service. Offline version is hard because you actually need a dedicated server that does a lot of operations in the cloud. So there's a lot of logic that's being conducted, and there's a lot of querying things like weather and traffic and air quality and all kinds of stuff that actually have determinations on what happens in the story world. So we'll probably stay online for a little while longer.